I take your point. There's no question that there are a lot of things that, that populists on the extremes of the left and the right say that are absolutely, they are pointing to serious problems with mainstream politics. We wouldn't have the problems, we wouldn't have the rise of populism had you had actually decent, policies that actually helped everyone.
I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Vivien Schmidt. I have been hoping to book her for a long time. We started planning this many, many months ago, and boy, are you here at the right time, as luck would have it. The news is really very, very much in need of your help in explaining. She is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, a wonderful World Boston partner, as well as founding director of BU's Center for the Study of Europe, and the author of an upcoming book. Oxford University Press coming spring, is publishing Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, a new book on the Eurozone crisis, so watch out for that. Dr. Schmidt's research focuses on European political economy, institutions, democracy, and political theory, in particular on the importance of ideas and discourse in political analysis. Her honors awards and fellowships include a Guggenheim Fellowship, an honorary doctorate from the Free University of Brussels, the Belgian Franke Inter-University Chair for Foreign Scholars, a Rockefeller Bellagio Center residency, and Fulbright fellowships to France and the UK. And she was recently named a Chevalier in the French Legion of Honor. Wow. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vivien Schmidt.
So I'm going to be talking about the rise of populism in Europe, but you can't really talk about the rise of populism in Europe without also talking about the rise of populism in the US and around the world. But so I'm going to be focusing on the rise of populism in Europe, but using the US also as a counterexample. So the big question for the rise of populism is why now, why in this way? How do we explain why it happened? And I guess the big question is about populist politicians being able to channel people's anger in different languages with similar messages. Here, the messages involve anti-immigration, anti-open borders, anti-globalization and free trade. In Europe in particular, anti-EU, anti-European Union, anti-Euro. In recent years, the extreme right in particular has added climate change to its anti-discourse. So it's populist leaders channeling this anger, and there's the same, well, there we go. There's the same range of sources. It's the economics of people feeling left behind. It's the sociology of those worried about the changing faces of the nation. It's the politics of those who want to take back control. It's also the crises, financial, Eurozone, migration, terrorism, Brexit. But the response is always with similar rhetorical strategies. It's about uncivil language in a post-truth environment. There's the rejection of experts and the rejection of mainstream media, fake news and all of that. But you also see populist politicians able to frame debates in new ways and using new media, but also exploiting the old media. So the big question for us, there you go, the big question is populism an existential threat to political and economic liberalism? And by political liberalism, we're talking about liberal democracies where you expect a balance of power, freedom of the press, judicial independence, and all of that. And economic liberalism would be free markets, free flow of goods and capital around the world with limited barriers to movement. So here I just thought you'd like to see a few faces of the range of populist politicians. And there could have been many more, but I don't think I need to point out Trump or Nigel Farage, but there's also Le Pen, Geert Wilders, there's the Lega, Matteo Salvini with Luigi Di Maio. Then there are the true Finns. Unfortunately, I don't know their name. They're now called Finns, and I don't know their names. But you've got Viktor Orban, you've got Hungarian Viktor Orban, you get Polish Kaczynski, but those are all on the extremes of the right, but there is also the left. Syriza in Greece, Podemos, etc. Vox, of course, is the newest party in Spain. We thought that Spain was inoculated against the extreme right, but Vox has. So lots of basically populist challenges to liberal democracy, and they've all popped up now, so recently. Not all, but. So how do we explain what are the sources of discontent, really? And that's what we're going to begin with. So I'll begin with the economic sources of discontent. So first, there are the ideas driving the economic policies. Neoliberalism. This is basically the philosophy of how one engages in economics or one runs the economy since the 1980s, beginning with Thatcher and Reagan, and of course you had change. In the 90s, it was the center left, but they still had deep principles, basic principles of neoliberalism, even as they tried to make it kinder and gentler with the social democratic overlay. And then when you had the economic crises, neoliberalism in terms of austerity comes back in. And then, of course, there's globalization, which is, has also, some people argue, like Danny Roderick, see it as hyper-globalization that creates a trilemma where if you have this, you can't have either national democracy or national sovereignty. So economic sources of discontent, you can see, are in the economic results themselves. The rise of inequality, which has become massive. It was going down in the post-war period, and it starts increasing and more recently spiking. And that's all about the 1% that Thomas Piketty talked about. Increases in poverty, and that goes with the rise of inequality. And of course, it's about the losers from globalization, people who feel left behind. It's worries, middle-class worries about loss of jobs and status. It's the service economy with mini jobs in Germany, for example. Or it's the platform economy, the gig economy. And for this, the question is, okay, if it's all about economics, why do we see the rise of populism in countries that have been doing well, that haven't suffered massive crisis, or at least now, or at least have rebounded? Central and Eastern European countries. Poland. That is the one country in Europe that didn't suffer from the crisis, and yet you've got an extreme right government in power. Sweden. We've got the Sweden Democrats. How do we explain that when Sweden's been doing perfectly well? And then, of course, why now? Why not earlier? All of these problems about people feeling left behind have been going on a very long time, especially as manufacturing jobs were moving out of Europe and even earlier out of the US. So why not, basically, if it's only about economics, why not everywhere or earlier? But what about the sociocultural sources of discontent? And here you need to talk about nostalgia for a lost past, fear of the other, and this is about, then we see that everywhere, massive rise in anti-integration feelings, in nativist resentment, talk about others cutting in line, feelings of national identity and sovereignty being under siege, or people feeling threatened by changing demographics. And generally, whether we're talking US or Europe, it's often white males, people who are older, less educated. And then people are also threatened by intergenerational shifts. Sorry, I should. By changing demographics, loss of status, and intergenerational shifts. But it's not just that. There's also a push for culture wars, and here we're talking about social conservatives, often anti-abortion, identity politics, the bathroom wars, as I call it. But again, why now? There's nothing new about that. The philosopher Carl Schmidt, a Nazi sympathizer, talked about ethnic nationalism as years ago, and sort of very much against the other. So nothing new about this. And again, why is it so acute in some countries and not others? Why do we see sort of a sudden rise in Germany, Denmark, and Italy, but still not Spain? So we've had the economics, we have the sociocultural. What about the political sources of discontent? And here, there's generally a feeling of loss of trust, loss of control. You can talk about in the US, it's Make America Great Again, i.e. America was no longer great. Or in the UK, Take Back Control. The Finns, obviously in Finland. The EU, the European Union, is heart of darkness, is the phrase they use. Or numbers of populist leaders in Central and Eastern European countries talk about the European Union as the empire, as if it's a substitute for the Soviet empire. Now we have the European empire, or seeing it as a colonizer. There's also a feeling that there's a failure of political institutions, that the institutions seem remote, and in any case, in favor of the rich and big business. And here you can talk about lobbies or whatever, the power of money. Beyond this, mainstream parties are hollowed out, and there's a real problem. Do we blame the populist politicians for their success, or do we blame mainstream parties for not responding, for not updating their messages or their policies? And the notion that mainstream parties are hollowed out isn't specifically, in particular in Europe, where the European Union, where decision-making has moved increasingly from the national level to the European level. And so that what you find is politicians feel themselves torn between being responsible to their international or supranational commitments, i.e. what they agreed to in council meetings at the European level, and being responsible to do that, or responsive to their citizens, who might very well want other policies, in particular, if you're in Southern Europe, if you're in Greece, and you're expected to do massive conditionality. There's also technocratic depoliticization, basically meaning that lots of issues that tended to be very political in the past are now treated technically by technocrats, i.e. by administrative officials, and they've been taken out of the realm of politics. Monetary policy is the best example. The Eurozone governance, EU level, which means that, it used to be national governments decided, no more in Europe. But even in the US, you can talk about the way in which not just monetary policy, but all sorts of policies have been taken out of the realm of politics and put in the hands of independent bodies that are presented as independent. But politics, where's politics? And so the feeling of loss of control is also with that. And so the result, we see polarization in the US, and here I don't need to tell you about this, red versus blue states, coasts versus the middle or the south, the base versus party elites. But in the EU, you have politicization, and it's a more complicated kind of situation where you have politicization at the bottom and from the bottom up. So at the bottom, we can talk about populist politicians taking over. From the bottom up is, as you have in particular populist governments, but even if you don't, and you have mainstream parties challenged by populist parties, you see the results having an effect on agreement or lack of agreement at the European Union level. So why was the Eurozone such a mess and not resolved? Were there solutions that would have helped solve it, Euro bonds or whatever? Impossible, because people couldn't agree. And that was already, we're talking mainstream politicians, but unable to reach positive agreements that would have helped everyone. Also because of very divergent interests and perceptions by their own electorates. And of course, all of this means at the top as well, you have an increasing political or politicized dynamics of interaction. In particular, for example, with the Eurozone crisis, again, North versus South, Wolfgang Schäuble saying, you know, you Southern Europeans, you need to take down your debt, your deficits, et cetera, and Southern Europeans saying, wait a minute, where's solidarity here? And also amongst institutions where Schäuble, again, basically complains about the Commission being flexible, giving opt-outs or giving derogations of the rules to Italy and Spain, or France, for good reasons. But again, so increasing conflict at that level without the kind of positive solutions that would be useful. But the question, in terms of the political sources of discontent, is again, why now? This is actually, these trends have been going on for a long time. So some people would say, well, there's an obvious, and some of you in there are saying, yeah, but come on, let's get to the point. It's about crises, right? It didn't happen because of crises. And of course, timing matters. There are trigger events, and the role of crises are important. Financial crisis, anger against bank bailouts and bonuses. We should ask about the election of President Trump. Was it an accident or an accident waiting to happen? And crises help that. In the Eurozone crisis and the crisis of sovereign debt, we can talk about the economic impact of austerity. We can talk about the increasing divergences between North and South as a result, or the sort of the Germans seeing what was going on as the dangers of a transfer union, to lazy Greeks versus we Germans who save, and the like. But there's also the refugee and migrant crisis. But here, what's interesting is the real crisis was in 2015 when you had hundreds of thousands of people crossing, of Syrian refugees crossing. By 2019, when Matteo Salvini becomes Interior Minister in Italy, it's down to a trickle. And yet it appears as if the crisis is worse. And that's because it's politicizing the crisis. It's about populist leaders constructing a crisis. Sure, it's not resolved, but it's nothing like what it was. And then, again, growing divisions, not just between North and South, but also between the West and the East, in particular linked to the refugee crisis, as Orban says, you know, not we're going to build a wall, we're going to build barbed wire fences, and does. And then, needless to say, there's Brexit. 30 years in the making, though. But it did happen with a referendum. So how do we conceptualize populism? That wasn't supposed to all come up like that, but such is life. How do we think about populism? And you note that I start out this talk, normally you'd expect me to define my terms, but actually it's very hard to define. Much better to illustrate all of the problems, to try to understand, okay, so these are the sources. So how do we explain populism? And so varieties of academics and analysts of various kinds have a whole wide range of definitions. So number one definition is it's about leaders' messages. It's a style of discourse. And the core is really appeals to the people. And blaming corrupt elites and the institutions. But generally with the appeals to the people, they all basically suggest that we speak for the people. But it's always only some of the people. So there's a great book out by Nadia Urbinati called Me the People. And what's useful about that is it's that there's always a charismatic leader who claims to speak for the people. But it's their base, it's generally a small number. But even as in the discourse itself, it's also very much about breaking taboos and sort of separation, us versus them. And just sort of Matteo Salvini, the former interior minister now in Italy, but the head of the League, the Lega, just to get a sense of the flavor of the discourse. So he was talking about the following year's European parliamentary election, and he said it will be a referendum between the Europe of the elites, banks, finance, mass migration, and precariousness versus the Europe of peoples, work, tranquility, family, and future. So very much an us versus them thing. What you often get is also an enumeration of the threats to national well-being, the politics of fear, the normalization of nationalist, xenophobic, racist, anti-Semitic discourse, treating migrants as criminals who are going to take your jobs and your daughters. They never say sons. And it's about breaking taboos of speech, of actually talking in xenophobic terms. Etc. But importantly, there's no one definition. Most are negative, and you'll see all the examples I've been giving so far. Most of them are negative. It's illiberal democracy as well. Some people say it's only discursive style. Others say it's Takis Pappas in a book basically says it's populist in power. And it's illiberal democracy because they're against liberal democracy. So you get power in order to undermine judicial independence, in order to reduce freedom of the press, or rather control the press, and that sort of thing. And there are those who argue that essentially it's all about an authoritarian drift. But there are a number of analysts who actually say, wait a minute, yes, there's an extreme right that tends to be that way, highly exclusive, but there are others, but there's also an extreme left that tends to be much more inclusive. So the extreme left tends to tell the more of the economic story and be pro-human rights. And in the case of Europe, they tend to, even if they say we want to leave Europe, they'll actually, no one's saying that anymore. The only good thing about Brexit is that all of the extreme right and extreme left parties have basically said, okay, we're not really going to leave Europe now, or the EU, and even not the euro. We just want a better Europe, one that follows our values. And for the extreme right, it's of course family values, etc., nationalism. But for the left, it's a more inclusive human rights, but also reductions in inequality, disruption of capitalism perhaps, but not even that. So interesting to see the difference. Although I have to say that what we've been seeing more recently on the extreme left in Europe, from Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, or Die Linke In Germany, both extreme left, there's a sort of a return to nationalism or sovereignism, and a certain amount of anti-immigrant stuff. But importantly, what you see is there is a difference between left and right populists, not only in terms of what they say, but also in terms of who votes for them. On the right, it's people who've always voted on the right who move farther to the right. And similarly on the left, it's people who've always voted for the left who then move farther left. Okay, but now more quickly, we can see leaders and their organic intellectuals. It's not just enough, it's not simply a charismatic leader. As often as not, they need ideas and there's someone behind them. President Trump had Steve Bannon for a very long time. This is Beppe Grillo on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's Casaleggio, Davide, father, and then he dies and his son takes over. And that's Marine Le Pen with her former organic intellectual, Philippon, who's now formed his own party, Les Patriotes. But so it's leaders and their organic intellectuals. It's important to see that you need to follow the ideas as well that come from not simply the leader, but also. But beyond this, how do they get their messages out? And so it's again back to language. It's the uncivil language that often destroys respect and trust. It's the politics of bullshit. We can talk about slander and verbal bullying. In the US, the best example is probably the election where it was crooked Hillary and lock her up in chance. But you also see that in many European countries, but not to that degree. But it's also about fake news creating a post-truth world. It's anti-expertise. You discredit experts and intellectuals. It's Michael Gove in the Brexit discussion, ranting against experts. And it's also, of course, fake news. And brilliantly accusing mainstream parties of fake news, even as you disseminate your own fake news. My favorite example of that is Jobbik, which is to the extreme right of Orban in Hungary, extreme right, who've created their own institute where they pull information from other sources and package it together as their news. Or the latest, which is here, which I saw yesterday, which is Dinesh D'Souza, this bizarre comparison of Greta Thunberg to Nazi posters, claiming that the Nazis were on the left in the 1930s. But again, fake news and populist post-truth. But it's also about lies and exaggerations. Framing is tremendously important in terms of heuristics. Hyperboles leave an impression that there's a large number, even if not as high. Thinking, I hate bringing only up Trump examples when I'm supposed to be talking about Europe, but they're just so good. Trump, who is reported as saying that people get excited by those who think big, and they want to believe things are the biggest. And that's what I call, he says, that's what I call truthful hyperbole. What? But anyway, I think that's tremendously important. And what you say in terms of the hyperbole leaves an impression of a large number, even if it's not as high. So the Brexit bus, that says it's 350 million pounds a week going from the that could be used for the NHS, that is going to Europe. Well, it's nowhere near that number, but it is a number. And the Remainers, in responding to it, said, no, it's not nearly that high, it's only this. Yeah, but people say, wait, that's a big number. Going to the EU rather than the NHS, they get their message across. And that is really the problem with all of these, with the way in which the sort of the psychology of the post-truth discourse. It creates a sense of intimacy. For example, again, Trump's incomplete sentences. You have people in the audience who are completing the sentences for Trump and therefore feeling close. And, basically lies and exaggerations stick with people. So that even if you know it's a lie, you kind of half believe it, or you forget that it's a lie over time. Okay. Beyond that, the populists are really good in terms of visual props. So just the one example over on the far left, which has a Native American chief. This is a 2009 poster for the European Parliament elections of the party of which the League is the successor. It was the Northern League. And this is, think about how beautifully perverse this is. The translation is they, meaning Native American chiefs, were subject to immigration, and now they live on reservations. Meaning, basically, we don't want immigration to Italy because look what happened to Native Americans in the US. But importantly, what you see is a shift from that kind of poster, and this is true for lots of these populist parties when you ask why now. It's also that populist parties have changed the way in which they present things. It was harshly xenophobic, anti-everything before, and then it becomes softer. Not that much softer, but still softer. And so the poster, underneath, this is a tweet by Salvini saying, look, I'm an ordinary guy, I'm eating Nutella toast. Or you'll see him with a bowl of pasta. So it's about humanizing. And then the posters in French, we're going to make French with the French. So this is clearly a white Christian view. Marine Le Pen's daughter basically says, choose your suburb. And you see the choice. And down below, of course, this was a Swiss poster, but then was taken up by the Danish extreme right. And that's, again, an anti-immigration, white sheep, black sheep. Okay. So part of this is that not only do they have they softened their image so that you get a kind of normalization of the discussion, but a way in which a lot more people think, okay, this is acceptable. But it's also the messages are circulating faster and faster. It's coordination via new social media. So you do have populist social movements that communicate in large measure through social media. And the new social media is key for these networks of dissent. And the Facebook posts, but you all know this, they become echo chambers of support, where most people get their news through Facebook from friends and families, and they also get fake news that way. And populists tend to rely more. And it's not just populists on the extremes of the right, also on the left. Podemos, basically, when the mainstream media were making it impossible for them to be heard, they had their networks, social networks. And it's new media like YouTube, blogs, social media, Twitter, and Facebook. There's also, of course, how this helps transnational networks. It's virtual networks of support through the alt-right, but also physical. It's Bannon in Europe. And if someone asks, I can tell you about my thoughts about, I went to see Bannon in Rome in a debate with an Italian social democrat. Really interesting, but I don't have time to tell you about this right now, so someone will have to ask me. But it's also political communication via the traditional media. Because in the traditional media as well, you see increasing fragmentation. You see it in Europe, you see it in the US. You see it's Fox News versus CNN or MSNBC. And it's TV, radios, newspapers. In Poland, it's Radio Maria, run by a Catholic cleric that has supported Kaczynski from the very beginning. But you also see The Sun, Murdoch, has been a major force in pushing for British Euroscepticism that has resulted very much in, that has had a major impact in terms of public attitudes toward the EU and ultimately Brexit. When Tony Blair left office and he was asked, why did you never say anything in favor of Europe when you were in the country, even though you were so pro-European? He said, impossible, Murdoch. And the traditional media play an important role in amplifying the social media network. The tweets become the stories of the day, and it's also the case that right-leaning messages in particular are reinforced via balance. So you've got someone on the extreme right, and you bring someone in on the center, as if this is, and you don't bring someone in on the extreme left, which means that where is the center? Well, it's somewhere between the center and the extreme right, which means it's much farther to the right than it would normally be. Media communication also helps messaging. It's much easier. There's a short news cycle, a 30-second soundbite, much easier to do a populist thing because you've got simple messages than to explain why it's more important to support human rights or why this or that is the way to solve problems. And of course, it's all about focused on leaders' personalities. News becomes entertainment, and to be perfectly honest, populists are more entertaining. You know, don't you think mainstream politicians are boring? Okay, they don't need to be, but in fact, we've got a problem here because populist political communication, you know, and by now, what you also see is that mainstream politicians are, in fact, becoming more populist in their discourse as a way of trying to counter, as a way of trying to get attention. So, but what about connecting the discourse to actions? Because it's really important. We've been talking so much about how they talk about things, but what do? Populists in opposition, well, we're still talking discourse now. It's pretty thin, and they don't really give much detail in terms of the policies and the programs. But we've got more and more populists in power. And actually, then they start doing things. They may compromise. So Alexis Tsipras in Greece actually compromised so much that, and of course he had to, given that he assumed, and rightly so, that the Greeks did not want to leave the euro or ultimately the EU. And Syriza has now essentially taken over the center-left. But often they do not compromise. And here we're talking about Orban, you're talking about Salvini on migration, Viktor Orban again on migration. And it would appear as if only the courts are there to safeguard the rule of law. But the EU hasn't done what it should have done in the case of Orban and Kaczynski in Poland. It's only started to. What's the result? Is there a move to illiberal democracy or authoritarianism? This is the big question. Lots of the books that I have put up here basically see democracies dying by elected populist leaders who subvert the democratic processes that brought them to power. Almost done. The one I think interesting thing is how do we differentiate populisms? You know, it's important to differentiate them within the EU, but between the US and the EU. Trump, as I mentioned before, was an accident, perhaps, an accident waiting to happen, but an accident with consequences. In the EU, we had Brexit, but then you had Macron, so people said, oh, we're okay. And then you got Italy, but then you had the European parliamentary elections, which had more on the extreme right, but still not so bad. Institutional differences matter. In the US, our strength in the economic crisis, centralized authority to be able to respond, was actually its weakness in the political. Trump, you couldn't have expected this. It's never happened before, but once it happens, the entire country is controlled. In the EU, the weakness in the economic crisis, no central authority to take explicit action, is its strength in the political. No one populist elected leader can take over. And in fact, they can't agree because they have very different views. Salvini and Orban may be both populists, but they have very different interests in the migration crisis. However, it may make deeper integration much more difficult in solving main problems. Okay, so in conclusion, is this a moment of great transformation? And if so, toward what? To a new illiberal paradigm? Are we going to be living with populism for the next 30 years? Is it possible for a revision of the liberal paradigm, i.e., for people to recognize there are problems that populists are pointing out, but there's another way forward? And I guess the question is, how do you counter the populist upsurge? Well, basically, we need new ideas, new discourse by new political leaders. But of course, this is more easily said than done. Thank you.
So another of the positive antis of the populists is that they're anti-war, both left and right. It was, of course, the liberal elites, the so-called experts who caused the disasters in Iraq and Libya and Yugoslavia and many other places. It's the liberal elites that want to devastate, encircle, and subjugate Russia, whereas the populists are more interested in improving relations with Russia. So, I mean, really, after Iraq, I mean, who would ever want to believe an expert again? It's about time that the liberal elites got their comeuppance. And the president actually has not started any new wars, not escalated any existing wars, so he's been a much more Pacific president than Obama, who created the surge in Afghanistan and went on to many other types of interventions. So we have to give the populists some credit, too, don't we, for creating an anti-interventionist type of politics.
What I was saying is the populists are bringing up issues that need to be addressed. There is a problem with mainstream parties and liberal elites. There's no question. So one needs to look at the policies one by one. I suppose the problem is that populists may propose one thing, may promise something, but they don't necessarily end up with that. So to give you just one illustration, when I was in Rome and listening to the debate between Steve Bannon and the Italian Social Democrat running for the European parliamentary elections, Bannon had been talking about the party of Davos and the elites and all of that and anti-experts. And the Calenda, the Italian, said, you know, it's all well and good if you talk about, you know, the party of Davos, but look at the tax break. Your president gave the party of Davos, the elites, the rich elites in the US. Bannon didn't respond to that. There was another that was interesting that takes us back to the differences, the tremendous differences in people's views and let's call it populist or call them concerned citizens in Europe. So Bannon then later said something about, and the European Central Bank, it is the worst. Look what it's doing to people's savings. You know, by its quantitative easing, it is destroying people's savings. And I thought to myself, he's been to Germany. He's talked to the AfD. And I knew exactly what the Italian was going to respond. And the Italian responds, what are you talking about? If it hadn't been for the European Central Bank and its quantitative easing, Italian banks would have failed completely. And Italian savings would have been gone. So there, so the point there is essentially that the problem for the transnational networks is they don't understand how different countries are. I mean, another example is the alt-right in the French elections, US alt-right and others, decided that they were going to try with chatbots and everything to alter, to help Marine Le Pen win. And they used Pepe the Frog as their example. Well, you know, it means that they don't understand that calling French frogs is not a good thing. So again, this is about, you know, sensitivity to the differences. But I take your point. There's no question that there are a lot of things that that populists on the extremes of the left and the right say that are absolutely, they are pointing to serious problems with mainstream politics. We wouldn't have the problems, we wouldn't have the rise of populism had you had actually decent, policies that actually helped everyone. Back to the economics and the rise of inequality, tremendously problematic.
Well, you sort of answered some of it. I was going to ask, would you agree that Bernie Sanders is a populist on the left, and who are other populists on the left in Europe, and how would you differentiate between populists on the right and populists on the left?
Okay.
That's a huge question.
That's a huge question, so I'll take a very small slice. But just to, I'm chuckling at this because we just had we were just talking about this. I was in Lisbon at a big event, and you had a philosopher, an American philosopher, political philosopher and analyst, and a European, Belgian, talking about populism. And the American got enraged when the European said, and Bernie Sanders, of course, is a populist. Because the Americans' definition of populism is always bad, it's always extreme right, it's about people who go from illiberal democracy to authoritarianism. Whereas the Europeans was, and this is Chantal Mouffe, who's very well known, sort of sees populism as a good thing, in particular on the left. Agonism, she used the example of Latin America, and she called Bernie Sanders a populism because it's about his discourse and the way in which he presents himself. For her, it was positive, so for the American, it was negative. If we define populism in terms of a style of discourse that talks about, that is anti-elite and corruption, et cetera, yes, Bernie Sanders is a populist. However, if you define populism as people who come to power with an intent to destroy liberal democracy to create a more illiberal democracy, i.e. destroy balance of power, freedom of the press, et cetera, then obviously Bernie Sanders is not a populist. And then the final answer is, it's tremendously important to distinguish populists on the extremes of the left and the right. And actually, you've got to look at each populist offer in its own right, because what you see is there are some that end up going very, very far on the left and the right, but in particular on the right, climate skepticism, that's the new, it started with basically anti-immigration, and you had 5-10%, and then more, and then you got the Eurozone crisis, and it was already up to 20%. That boosts it some more, and then you get the migration crisis again. But they're running out of topics, so it's climate skepticism is the latest, and you see it with the Finns, in Scandinavia and other Scandinavian countries. But this also suggests that what you see is these, the messages get picked up from various places. Build a wall, US, let's build barbed wire fences, great idea. So it's, and you're seeing the anti-migration stuff picked up, and then climate change.
Sorry.
One thing that is interesting is that everyone wants to defend the welfare state. But on the extreme right, it's welfare state just for us. So welfare chauvinism. On the extreme left, it's not that. It's, we just want to save the welfare state against neoliberal cuts, basically.
What are your thoughts on Putin, who seems to have backed, among others, Marine Le Pen with a sizable loan, trying to break up the EU and NATO and all that other stuff?
In the case of Marine Le Pen, she needed the money. Again, support of Putin, it's complicated. In some countries, whereas Marine Le Pen is happy to take money from Putin and has a kind of pro-Russia policy. And in Italy, you see Salvini and League and Five Star saying Russia's fine. The Poles will not be part of the same party European parliamentary party system with Marine Le Pen because she supports Russia, whereas the Poles see Russia as the enemy. So there's no generalization I can make about Russia, but except for the fact that you do see Russian interference, not just in the 2016 American elections or even attempts in the midterms, but you see it all over Europe. It's just that the languages are so different, they don't have the same kind of skills. In English, it's much, much easier, and you saw a lot of it in Brexit that actually was before the US election, but much harder to do it in French, in Italian. The European elections as well, what you saw is also European governments recognized that this was a threat and actually did a lot more to try to stop it.
Can I just ask a follow-up? You're saying there's a Russian influence on Brexit?
In the elections, definitely. Definitely. I mean, that's well documented. Even before, that was the kind of the dry run before the 2016 US elections.
Okay, well, as many kinds of populisms as there are, and as many languages in Europe and more, we have questions. But we're going to stop this part now, then we're going to go upstairs and have some mingling. But first, we have to thank Dr. Schmidt very much.
Thank you.